Russia's population will shrink by 20 million people in the next 25 years. Its working-age population is collapsing at a rate not seen since World War II. 800,000 of its brightest minds fled the country in a single year. The nation that once competed with America in the space race now cannibalizes aircraft for spare parts. And here's the most shocking part. This isn't a temporary crisis. This is a structural collapse from which there is no recovery. The Russian Federation is dying, not metaphorically, not politically, demographically, technologically, and economically dying. 4 terminal conditions are converging to create an inescapable death spiral that will reduce this former superpower to an economic wasteland by 2050. The data is brutal. The trajectory is irreversible. And what's happening inside Russia right now is far worse than what the Kremlin wants you to believe. I'm James Whitfield from Faultline Economics. While others chase headlines, we examine the systems that actually shape history, geography, demographics, and economic fundamentals. Today, we're analyzing Russia's terminal economic collapse. This is strategic clarity in a complex world. Let's turn to the strategic map. The Russian Federation, the world's largest country by landmass, spanning 11 time zones, sitting atop vast reserves of oil, gas, and minerals, a nuclear superpower, a permanent UN Security Council member. On paper, this should be one of the world's most powerful economies. But beneath this facade of strength lies a nation in advanced stages of systemic failure. Since February 2022, the mask has slipped. What we're witnessing isn't just the impact of sanctions or the cost of war. It's the acceleration of decades-old structural weaknesses that were always going to destroy the Russian economy. The invasion of Ukraine didn't cause these problems, it revealed them. The numbers tell a story of inexorable decline. Russia's GDP per capita remains stuck at $15,000 lower than Romania, barely above China, a fraction of any developed economy. Its share of global high-tech exports? Less than 0.3% life expectancy for Russian men. 68 years, comparable to North Korea. These aren't statistics from a rising power. These are symptoms of a dying state. Beyond the headlines, there are systems. Let's connect the dots. Factor 1. Russia is experiencing the worst peacetime demographic collapse in modern history. The total fertility rate has crashed to 1.4 children per woman, far below the 2.1 needed for population stability. In the first quarter of 2025, Russian women gave birth to fewer babies than at any point in the last 25 years. Think about that. Fewer births than during Stalin's purges, World War II, or the collapse of the Soviet Union. But here's where it gets interesting. It's not just about births. Russian men die at rates comparable to sub-Saharan Africa. The life expectancy gap between men and women is 11 years, one of the largest on Earth. Cardiovascular disease, accidents, violence, and catastrophic levels of alcoholism are killing working-age men by the hundreds of thousands each year. Now add the brain drain. Since 2022, between 800,000 and 900,000 Russians have fled the country. But these aren't random emigrants. 80% hold university degrees. 1 in 10 has a PhD. 50 to 70,000 IT specialists vanished in the first month of the war alone. This is a surgical extraction of Russia's future. The young, educated, innovative minds that any modern economy needs to survive. The UN projects Russia's population will fall to 121 million by 2050. The working-age population will crash from 100 million to just 69 million. This changes the entire equation. Factor 2. Russia has fallen into an innovation chasm from which it cannot escape. The country spends less than 1% of GDP on research and development, half the OECD average, a third of China's investment. Even worse, 98% of all R&D funding comes from the state. There is virtually no private sector innovation. Here's what they won't tell you. Before 2022, Russia was completely dependent on Western technology. Over 80% of its commercial aircraft were Boeing or Airbus. Its Arctic energy projects required Western drilling technology. Its entire IT infrastructure ran on Western hardware and software. Even its domestic aircraft programs like the MC-21 were 60 to 90% composed of Western components. The sanctions have triggered technological regression on a massive scale. Russian airlines now officially cannibalize planes for parts, stripping engines from one aircraft to keep another flying. Aviation incidents have doubled. The flagship MC-21 program costs have soared 80%, with production delayed indefinitely. Cars are being produced without airbags or anti-lock brakes. Let me show you exactly what I mean. Russia is reliving the Soviet Union's fatal mistake, missing the technological revolution while clinging to 20th century industries. The pivot to China? A dangerous illusion. China cannot provide cutting-edge semiconductors it doesn't produce itself. Russia has become a dumping ground for second-tier technology at premium prices. Factor 3. The resource curse that's destroying Russia from within. Oil and gas revenues account for 30 to 50% of the federal budget, depending on prices. They dominate over 45% of all exports. This is textbook Dutch disease. Resource wealth has killed every other sector of the economy. Russian manufacturing productivity is 40% of Brazil's, 1/3 of South Africa's. The entire economy is a hostage to commodity prices. When oil booms, Russia booms. When oil busts, Russia busts. There is no economic diversification, no competitive manufacturing, no high-tech exports worth mentioning. Now, here's where geography becomes destiny. The International Energy Agency projects global fossil fuel demand will peak by 2030. The energy transition is not a distant threat. It's happening now. Europe, Russia's primary market, is rapidly decarbonizing. The pivot to Asia means accepting massive discounts and building expensive new infrastructure for diminishing returns. This is where systems thinking matters. Russia's vast oil and gas reserves, its supposed strength, are becoming stranded assets. The entire economic geography of the country, from Siberian pipelines to Arctic terminals, is oriented around extracting and exporting fossil fuels that the world will progressively stop buying. If you find this analysis valuable, subscribe to Faultline Economics. We dive deep into the structural forces shaping our world every week. Factor 4. The institutional dead end that makes recovery impossible. Russia ranks 154th out of 180 countries in corruption perception, its worst score ever. Independent experts estimate corruption consumes 25% of GDP. Property rights don't exist in any meaningful sense. The expropriation of Yukos sent a clear message. Everything you own can be taken if you fall from political favor. The data doesn't lie. Capital flight averaged $15 to $20 billion annually, even in good years. In 2022 alone, $232 billion fled the country. This is a continuous vote of no confidence by Russia's own elite. They extract value as quickly as possible and move it offshore where the rule of law exists. The sanctions have severed Russia from global financial systems. Over 1,200 foreign companies have fled, taking technology, expertise, and integration with them. The exclusion from SWIFT, the freezing of $300 billion in central bank reserves, the denial of access to Western capital markets, Russia is now permanently locked out of the global economy that drives innovation and growth. But all of this hinges on one deciding factor: demographics. You can theoretically fix corruption. You can develop new technologies. You can diversify away from resources. But you cannot manufacture young, educated, productive workers from thin air. Russia's demographic collapse is irreversible. The women who would bear the next generation are increasingly those who were never born. The innovators who could modernize the economy have fled. The cascade has begun, and mathematics makes recovery impossible. Now, let's connect the dots together. What do you think will happen when Russia's working-age population collapses by 30%? Can any economy survive losing a third of its workforce while supporting a massive elderly population? Drop your analysis in the comments. I read every strategic insight you share. Given these dynamics, we're approaching a strategic inflection point. Russia faces 3 converging crises by 2030. The demographic cliff accelerates as the small 90s generation enters its peak productivity years. Global oil demand peaks just as Russia needs maximum revenues, and the technological gap with the West becomes unbridgeable as AI and green technology reshape the global economy. Here's where it all comes together. Each crisis reinforces the others. Demographic decline means fewer innovators. Technology stagnation means lower productivity. Resource dependence means no economic diversification. Institutional failure means no solutions. This isn't a downturn. This is systems failure. For a deeper dive into how Russia reached this point, I recommend Putin's People by Catherine Belton. It's the definitive investigation of how the KGB captured the Russian state and led it to this catastrophe. Get your free trial through Audible with the link below. This analysis connects directly to our video on Russia's geographic prison. You can find that breakdown in the card on screen and linked in the description. It reveals why Russia's geography makes economic modernization nearly impossible. So what does this mean for the global balance of power in 2050? If current trends continue, Russia will be unrecognizable. Population under 120 million. Working-age population halved. Cut off from global technology. Oil and gas revenues in terminal decline. GDP per capita falling further behind not just the West, but China, India, even Central Asia. This is not managed decline. This is the economic equivalent of demographic and technological extinction. A nuclear-armed state with the economy of a medium-sized developing nation, incapable of maintaining its vast territory or projecting power beyond its borders, the Russian Federation as we know it cannot survive these converging catastrophes. The future isn't written, but the blueprint is there for those who know how to read it. And Russia's blueprint shows terminal decline encoded in demographics, technology, resources, and institutions that cannot be reformed. The collapse isn't coming. It's already here. It's just happening in slow motion, hidden behind oil revenues and wartime spending that mask the underlying decay. But structural forces don't lie. And the data shows a one-way trajectory toward economic irrelevance. If you gain something from this analysis, subscribe to Faultline Economics and give this video a like. We're building more content like this every week, cutting through the noise to reveal the systems that actually shape our world. And as always, stay strategic.